Thanks everyone for having me. So in this talk I'll go over sort of the highlights of some of my research with political fact checkers. I'll give you kind of an overview. And I'll focus mostly on sort of the history and the practice of this fairly unusual kind of news work. It's a style of news work which is so commonplace today, it's so widespread, that it's easy to forget, I think, that it's barely a decade old. What I call the fact-checking movement in American journalism is barely a decade old. And I do think it's important to think of this as a kind of professional movement. And so I'll talk a bit about that. And if we have time, we'll also maybe talk a bit about the sort of epistemological challenge that professional journalists face when they're trying to adjudicate political claims, and why it's so difficult for fact-checkers to settle factual debates in a way that, you know, is satisfying or actually ends the conversation, why their work is so controversial. So we'll talk about as much of that as we sort of have time for. But I find that at the outset, it's very important always to distinguish the kind of political fact-checking that I study from traditional fact-checking, which has long been a feature of journalism, especially at newspapers and magazines. And so I'll start with an example that I often use in the classroom that I like very much because it captures the difference very sharply. So this is a picture of our former president when he had just graduated from Harvard Law School. This is from a promotional booklet which was put together by his literary agent. I guess he was already at work on his first memoir. And so I wonder if anybody can spot the fairly grave mistake that appears first. Right. So this pamphlet suggests that the president, well, he's not yet the president, but he was the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review, that he was born in Kenya and raised in Indonesia and Hawaii. When, of course, he was born in Hawaii, this would become, you know, a fairly vivid political controversy 20 years later. And at the height of that controversy, the person who actually put this pamphlet together said publicly, this was nothing more than a fact-checking error by me. There was never any information given to us by Barack Obama suggesting that he was born in Kenya and not in Hawaii. And I like this example because it captures perfectly the sort of spirit of traditional fact-checking, the need to, you know, correct all of the details, to get all of the facts right before you run off 10,000 or 100,000 or maybe several million copies of your publication, whether that's, you know, the Gutenberg Bible or a magazine or a newspaper or whatever it is that you're printing. This is an impetus which is as old as the printing press. That defining impulse is very different from sort of the orienting spirit of political fact-checking, which I study, because political fact-checking is not about correcting mistakes before they're made public, right? Rather, it's about correcting misinformation once it's already out there in the public sphere, and that's a fundamentally different mission that introduces new tensions for the journalist. So I'll give you another example that I think captures very well the spirit of political fact-checking and why it's so interesting. This is an example that also, not surprisingly perhaps, has to do with the question of the president's birthplace. And I assume that the audio will just go right through here too, right?
Yeah, okay. I don't know.
Let's hope, because the audio is really interesting here.
Donald, you and I have known each other for a long time.
We're trying to fix it.
Trying to see?
If you have a little cable.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to see. Where is it? Do you know one?
No, I'm sorry. Can everyone hear it?
Yeah, or I can just play it.
Yeah, I think we can hear it.
You know what? I just realized. Let me try one thing.
But it must be an audio cable.
Oh, I got it.
It's your...
I think I just had to change the output.
Yeah.
There for a long time, and I don't understand why you're doubling down on this birther issue after the state of Hawaii formally says this is the legitimate birth certificate, he was born in Hawaii, why are you going through all of this stuff?
Well, a lot of people don't agree with that birth certificate.
But if
A
the
lot
state
people
of
do not
Hawaii
think it's
authorizes it, if the state of Hawaii says this is official, he was born in Hawaii on this date, here it is, why do you deny them?
A lot of people do not think it was an authentic certificate.
How can you say that if
A lot of people think
this-
it was reported, well, but many people do not think it was authentic. His mother was not in the hospital. There are many other things that came out, and frankly, if you would report it accurately, I think you'd probably get better ratings than you're getting, which are pretty small.
Donald, have you seen the actual newspaper announcements within days of his birth in Honolulu? For example, the Honolulu Star Bulletin will put it up there. You see the birth announcement back in 1961. The Honolulu, listen to me, Donald. Honolulu, can I ask a question?
Defending Obama?
Donald, you're beginning to sound a little ridiculous. I have to tell you.
Let me tell you something. I think you sound ridiculous.
When is it from?
That's from 2012. So I like this example because it captures, I think, both how appealing this can be as a style of watchdog journalism, how entertaining, in fact, it can be, right? This is more engrossing than most reporting from the campaign trail, most political coverage. But at the same time, it also illustrates the potential awkwardness for, objective, nonpartisan journalists,
Right.
journalists who see themselves that way, and are put in the position, inevitably, of behaving a little bit like prosecutors in ways that invite accusations of bias, right? And you heard Donald Trump make such an accusation just in those couple of minutes. What Wolf Blitzer did not point out in that segment was the fact that most of the research that he put up on the screen there, the newspaper clippings and all of that, had actually been done years earlier, beginning in 2008, by the full-time political fact-checking organizations that I've studied most closely, that are kind of the main subjects of my book. And those are FactCheck.org, which was founded in 2003 and is based at the University of Pennsylvania, and PolitiFact and the Washington Post fact checker, both of which came on the scene in 2007. Now these three groups have really led a sort of national and also global surge in fact-checking. And in the US, I argue, they've more or less explicitly and deliberately built a professional movement, a kind of reform movement around this style of journalism based on an explicit critique of the way that reporters traditionally did their job, which was to not correct false political claims, right? So part of what they're doing is making an argument about how all reporters should behave when confronted with false statements. It's interesting that this style of fact-checking has spread very quickly around the world. This map is from a count which was done just last month in February by the Duke Reporters Lab. There are now something like 115 dedicated fact-checking outlets in 47 different countries around the world. That's up 20% from the figure just 1 year ago. And what I think is most revealing and most interesting is that more than 90% of those, almost all of them, came on the scene since 2010. In fact, most of them were founded in just the last 3 or 4 years, well over 80% of them. So this is something new globally, and it's something which is growing extremely quickly. And it's important also, still by way of introduction, to observe just how widespread fact-checking was during the 2016 presidential race in the United States. It's something that has increased with each election beginning in 2004, but it really sort of reached new heights in 2016 when it seemed like every news outlet practically unveiled its own system for rating political claims. So this is CNN fact-checking one of the primary debates. They use this 6-point scale, which is modeled, pretty explicitly on PolitiFact's Truthometer that they introduced in 2007. These are the big three broadcast networks: NBC, ABC, and CBS. NBC called this operation the Truth Squad. ABC had this 6-point color-coded scale that they used to check debate claims. And lest you think this is solely a phenomenon of the liberal mainstream media, Fox News has also been an avid fact checker in the last couple of presidential elections. They fact checked, both Republicans and Democrats pretty intensely during the 2016 race. I'll play you just a minute of what that looks like, what that looked like in a fact check from 2016.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. You were totally in favor of it.
That is just not accurate.
You called it the gold standard.
You call it the gold standard. True or false?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And what's interesting, this has been a problem for Mrs. Clinton for a while, is that she was for it. Dozens of times she articulated in public that she was for it, and she's been called on that she was flip-flopping, and yet she still tries to reinforce a different kind of version.
So in that case, they found that what Donald Trump was saying was true. They did also, bring to light many of his false claims over the course of the campaign. What I mainly like about that is this really cool, sort of old school stamp logo. That's not something you see very much anymore. We also saw a lot of innovation in the sort of elite media. The New York Times, has been fact-checking pretty avidly for the last decade during elections. But in 2016, for the first time, they unveiled their own rating system. So depending on their degree of truth, claims were coded either red or yellow or green. And the fact checks were published as these little capsule verdicts. And if you clicked on any one of these, you got a paragraph or two explaining how the reporter reached that conclusion. And what was really cool about this is that it could be aggregated on a single page, so you could see all of the fact checks of different candidates from the race. And also, these little verdicts could be embedded into straight news reports online. So if a claim came up again in the course of coverage, they would just insert the fact check right into the campaign trail report. That's something that they've never done before. Lastly, NPR did something pretty extraordinary in 2016. They relied on an automated transcription service to supply transcripts of the debates almost in real time as the debates were taking place. And then they had a team of 20 or so reporters. It varied a little bit depending on the debate. But they had a team of 20 or so reporters who would actively annotate that transcript with fact checks and with other bits of analysis as the debate was still unfolding. So this is what that looked like. By the end of the first debate, they had something like 75 different annotations embedded in the transcript, including many fact checks. This was incredibly popular. So that page was viewed by more than 6 million people in the couple of days after the debate. They're continuing to do this, by the way. They did it again during Trump's joint address to a joint session of Congress last month. And I'll just say lastly that fact-checking is pretty popular as a style of journalism. Sites like PolitiFact, on some days during the 2016 race, reached more than 2 million page views, which is really extraordinary for a small, wonky, fact-checking and news analysis site. And when NPR surveyed its listeners in 2015 about what kind of coverage they wanted to see and hear during the upcoming race, fact-checking was the second most popular response right after the actual election results. So this is the kind of journalism that audiences are enthusiastic about, which is one reason that news outlets have embraced it so avidly. By the way, feel free to ask questions as I go along. So how did we get here? I mean, I've said that this style of reporting and the fact-checking movement is something new that's a little more than a decade old. But this genre does have a kind of prehistory in American journalism, which is important to look at because it shows sort of both how awkward this can be for professional reporters and how they've struggled with the question of fact-checking over the decades. And it shows how a kind of conversation emerged within the precincts of professional journalism that I think produced the fact-checking movement that we've seen, emerge more robustly in the last decade. So the first example of something like political fact-checking by straight news reporters that I've been able to find, at least, the first examples come from the early 1980s, when there was kind of a wave of fact-checking inspired by the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan came into office, actually, with a really well-established reputation for getting, the details wrong in his speeches, for making mistakes, mangling the details of the various, government programs that he was promising to slash. So I'll give you an example. This is an article reporting on a 1982 press conference that the president had given about the economy. Actually, it's a transcript of the entire press conference. Newspapers used to do that. And so the Washington Post carried that transcript the day after the press conference. And then the day after that, they ran this follow-up piece, which was a fact check listing all of the factual mistakes that the president had made during his press conference. And they justified this extraordinary level of scrutiny by pointing to his well-established reputation for, messing up details, saying that this was a, familiar pattern. Over the course of the decade, or the first few years of the decade, they kind of refined the format. So here's another example. This is from 1985. What you see on the left is the continuation of a front-page report, again in the Washington Post, which was about a major speech that the president had given praising the progress that the white regime in South Africa had supposedly made in dismantling apartheid. And what you see on the right is this little fact-checking box that took about 5 different claims that the president made and debunked them. And you see the president's claims are in bold, and then the reporter's words, debunking those claims follow immediately. So, for instance, the president claimed that South Africa had eliminated segregation in movie theaters and restaurants, and then the reporters pointed out, actually that's not true. Hotels and restaurants need permits to serve blacks, and many are still completely off limits. So they debunked his claims one by one. What's especially fascinating about this little burst of fact-checking at the Post is that it didn't last very long. A couple of decades later, one of the best-known Post editors from that era, Walter Pincus, was being interviewed about this, and he said that after a while, the public at large, objected to this kind of reporting. They thought that it was unfair to the president, and then, as he said, we stopped doing it, we stopped truth squatting every press conference, we left it then to the Democrats. And that captures what has been kind of the default approach of objective journalists when faced with a controversial claim, which is simply to report, competing claims, report both sides of the debate, and leave it up to readers to decide, where the truth lies. That's exactly what today's fact-checkers react against. They argue that that's not how reporters should cover politics. Another major and very interesting turning point, I think, came in the 1988 presidential contest between George Herbert Walker Bush on the left there and Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. This campaign, this race, very quickly came to be seen by journalists and by political pundits and commentators as a kind of low point in American politics, because it was so dominated by negative advertising and by false advertising, by these baseless accusations being hurled back and forth in a way that a lot of observers said was unprecedented. It was a lot worse than what we'd seen in the past. And eventually this provoked a kind of backlash among political reporters who started to more aggressively fact-check those false claims. So I'll give you an example. This is one of the most famous TV commercials in the history of American political advertising. This is the famous tank script which the Bush campaign aired against Dukakis. It's been credited by a lot of observers with helping to turn the tide against Dukakis just in the last couple of weeks of the campaign. You know, of course, we can't know that for sure, but it was a very hard-hitting ad.
Every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber and a ground emergency warning system against nuclear attack. He even criticized our rescue mission to Grenada and our strike on Libya.
So you get the idea. The only problem with that list of claims was that they were almost entirely false, right? As governor of Massachusetts, Dukakis hadn't weighed in on, on the viability or the need for many of these weapon systems. And in fact, he was on the record as supporting a handful of the systems that he was being accused of being against. There's also the opinion that what really hurt him was this fairly goofy picture, the way that he looked wearing this really large helmet and riding around in this tank. Anyhow, the Dukakis campaign objected strenuously to this attack. They held a press conference about it, complaining about all of the false charges being leveled against them. And some reporters picked up the cue. So this is an article that ran 3 days later, again in the Washington Post, which focused on debunking a couple of campaign ads from each side of the campaign. So Bush ads and Dukakis ads, but they really took apart that tank ad and pointed out that Dukakis hadn't been against all of those weapons programs. The day before that Post piece ran, actually, we saw what I think is the very first example of a video fact check. And this was aired again by ABC News, which was kind of a leader in this respect. And it's worth looking at because it captures, again, some of the tensions that are involved in the format. So this is from 1988.
Defense system we developed.
In fact, he supports a range of new weapons, including the Trident II missile.
He opposed anti-satellite weapons.
In fact, Dukakis would ban those weapons only if the Soviets did the same principle incorporated in the INF Treaty, which George Bush supports.
He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment.
In fact, Dukakis opposes not 4 missile systems, but 2 as expensive and impractical, and never opposed deploying Pershing II.
Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber.
In fact, Dukakis has supported the stealth bomber. While this commercial is an especially glaring example of how to fiddle with your opponent's record for your own benefit, it's only fair to note that Democrats haven't been above doing it to George Bush.
In fact, in 1985, George Bush personally cast the tie-breaking Senate vote to cut Social Security benefits.
No, not to cut, but to freeze benefits. If the government ever gets around to putting a warning label on TV campaign commercials the way they do on cigarettes, maybe it ought to read something like this. If in the heat of a presidential campaign you're tempted to buy something one guy says about the other guy in his TV ads, caveat emptor, buyer beware. Richard?
So what's most revealing about that, I think, is the way that the producer sandwiched in this little fact check of Dukakis at the end of this pretty extended debunking of the Bush campaign ad. And the person you saw on the screen there, the producer, Dick Threlkeld, actually complained about that 4 years later at a conference at the Annenberg Center. And he said that the problem for journalists, right, doing this kind of fact-checking, is that you always want to find 2 sides of a story. In this case, there was really only one side of the story, but I was unsuccessful in convincing them, meaning his bosses, that that sometimes there's only one side of the story. So it shows how difficult it is for journalists to really, go after false claims without needing to appear to balance their criticisms, even if you see more extensive deception from one side of the political spectrum. That's something that today's fact checkers are very familiar with. It's, the awkward nature of this style of journalism is something that they talk about a lot, both internally, in training sessions and when they're just, talking about their jobs in the office, and at various public meetings, conferences, on their mailing lists, etc. So it's something I heard constantly during my field work. What you see on the left here is the training manual that PolitiFact gives out to new fact checkers who were hired into its network. And on the very first page of the manual, it says, "We practice a gutsy form of reporting that can feel a little bit awkward at first. After being trained for years not to take sides, you will now have to choose which side is right." So they're constantly reinforcing how difficult this can be for traditional journalists. They've had, over the last decade, more and more venues in which to have those kinds of conversations, and that's where this, what I call the fact-checking movement, has really taken root. So this is a picture from, I think it was the second annual Global Summit of Fact Checkers, which took place in London in 2014. If you look really closely, you'd see me right there, taking notes about all these fact checkers and what they're talking about. It's in venues like this. This is another list of all the conferences they've had over the last 7 or 8 years. It's in venues like that that fact checkers have articulated their critique of traditional journalism and sort of made their call for other reporters to follow them, right, and to start covering campaigns more aggressively. This is very much in keeping with what Barbie Zelizer has famously called meta-journalistic discourse, right, the kind of discourse that takes place in venues like conferences or in professional journals, etc., like the Columbia Journalism Review or the American Journalism Review. And she argues that this kind of meta-journalistic discourse is the vehicle through which fact checkers start to tell the story, journalists in general, tell the stories that help to justify changes in objective practice, right? They help to legitimate potentially controversial new approaches to reporting, and that's exactly what we've seen in the development of fact-checking over the last decade. Any questions about any of that? Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the sort of day-to-day routines of fact-checking, and then we'll jump ahead to the question of why it's so sort of controversial. So how do fact-checkers sort of go about their work day-to-day? What are the routines that they use to adjudicate factual debates between politicians? Well, I'll give you an example that I heard during my field work while I was visiting the site FactCheck.org, which is based at the University of Pennsylvania. And I like this example because it shows how fact checkers like to present their work publicly, right? So an editor there explained to me that he'd been riding the train to work. This was in 2011. He'd been riding the train to work, just a few weeks earlier, and he was reading the paper as he often did, and he came across this article, which was reporting on a speech that the governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour, had made attacking the Obama administration. Now, Haley Barbour at that time was a possible presidential contender. These are the kinds of subjects that fact checkers really like to go after, especially during campaigns. So the fact checker told me, the editor told me, he's reading this article, and right away, the third paragraph, sort of leaps off the page, and this is a quote from the governor's speech in which he claims that in the last 2 years, the federal government spent $7 trillion. In other words, the Obama administration spent $7 trillion. And at the same time, the economy lost 7 million jobs. So he's reading this, he says, and the figures immediately sound funny to him. So he gets to work, he boots up his computer, and in about a minute, by going to the website of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, he confirms that this governor, Haley Barbour, has doubled the actual number of job losses under President Obama. And as he said to me, this was a fact that went completely unchallenged by the New York Times reporter, in that article, despite the fact that the New York Times is the best newspaper that we have in this country. This is something you hear privately all of the time from professional fact checkers who say that, in a perfect world, they'd be out of a job because reporters wouldn't let these false claims into their reporting in the first place, especially when they're, so consummately easy to check as this one was. So the day after that Times article ran, FactCheck.org carried this piece, which debunked Haley Barbour's claims. It did it in very straightforward language, saying that Haley Barbour had grossly exaggerated the nation's job losses under President Obama. He was dead wrong. He's not even close. As evidence, it linked back to the Times article, to a transcript of the speech, and also to two different authoritative sources of government data, the official U.S. budget and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where they found that the actual number of job losses in the last 2 years. So these are the kinds of examples that fact checkers often give when they're asked to describe what they do. And they really underscore the simplicity of the enterprise, right? There's no debating this, We went to the official sources, we looked up the true facts, and showed that the claim was false. Fact checkers constantly underscore that they rely on nonpartisan, which usually means official, sources of public data. So this passage is from a statement of principles, an internal statement of principles that PolitiFact was using during my fieldwork that said, the best sources are independent and nonpartisan. At the national level, that means agencies like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, and so on. New interns at FactCheck.org were given a list of approved sources that included these same agencies. And yet, of course, as we know, fact checkers' work is very often controversial, right? And even when they're relying on these kind of public official data sources, their articles always provoke disagreement and controversy, sometimes even when they're checking seemingly straightforward claims about things like unemployment. In fact, the most heated internal dispute that I heard during my fieldwork, my original fieldwork with fact checkers, was about a very straightforward claim. This is during the 2012 race, a very straightforward claim that Mitt Romney had made about unemployment under President Obama. He said, making a sort of odd comparison, he said that there were more people out of work in the United States than were employed in all of Canada, right? It's not clear why that's relevant, but he said it. PolitiFact decided to investigate it. But the way that he had phrased that, saying that there were more people out of work, left some room for disagreement about which unemployment standard to use, because, as you might know, there are actually a host of different standards that are produced even by the government, and of course, academic economists sometimes produce other ones. So the standard you choose depends, for instance, on whether you want to count people who are only marginally attached to the labor force, or even people who have given up looking for work altogether, right? There was one editor at PolitiFact who felt very strongly that those people who've dropped out of the labor force, should be included in the count. And if you included them, then Romney's claim was closer to actually being true. But all of the other people in the room disagreed with her and thought that the official, the most common unemployment measure, which doesn't include those people, is the one to use. And this led to this really heated argument that actually lasted all afternoon. And the editors had to convene 3 different times before finally agreeing that, that Romney's claim was false. So there are countless examples like this that come up, all of the time in the work of fact checkers that show how even straightforward claims can be so difficult to adjudicate. I'll give you one more, much more recent and I think really compelling illustration. And this has to do with another seemingly straightforward fact check of a very vivid claim that the First Lady made at the climax of her speech at the Democratic National Convention last summer.
I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I watch my daughters, 2 beautiful, intelligent black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn.
Okay, we seem to be running out of time, and I do want to leave room for questions, but let's close out this example. Whoops. I wonder, so obviously this claim drew a lot of attention. Pretend you didn't see what I just showed. I wonder whether people think that was in fact true, that the White House was built by slaves. No.
I don't know.
You don't know. Nobody wants to venture, I guess.
Once I fact checked it.
You fact checked it. Just now. So indeed, yeah, it was, right? PolitiFact and a number of other journalists investigated this claim because many people had objected to it. And PolitiFact ruled it true. They found that slaves were indeed involved in erecting the White House beginning in 1792. In fact, there's a page at the website of the White House Historical Association where you can find actual records of the payments that were made to slave owners for the work that was performed by their slaves. So PolitiFact explained, strictly speaking, the White House wasn't exclusively built by slaves, but slaves were significantly involved in the construction. So we rate the claim true. Now this yielded a deluge of protest from people who disagreed with that verdict, and PolitiFact published a follow-up editor's note. And it's pretty interesting to review some of the objections that people had. So one objection was that, as PolitiFact had acknowledged, not only slaves were involved in the construction. And a related point was that slaves may not have been as harshly treated as we might imagine, and that therefore it's misleading to say slaves were involved because people would have some picture of brutal treatment under harsh conditions, when in fact, supposedly, as Bill O'Reilly asserted, among others, the slaves that worked there were well-fed and had decent lodgings provided by the government. PolitiFact actually asked a historian about this, who said, no matter how you look at it, this was backbreaking work, and that has no bearing on whether or not the laborers were slaves, right? Another objection was that some of the slaves may have been paid for their labor, and the same historian PolitiFact spoke to said, well, it might be the case that slaves who worked on their one day off got to keep those wages. But again, that doesn't speak to the underlying question of whether or not they were slaves. The most interesting and revealing objection, I think, was that, as one person wrote, the White House has been rebuilt since then. So this is a false statement The White House was fully reconstructed from 1814 to 1817, and then again from 1947 to 1952. Every single stone laid by the original laborers has been moved and put there again by paid workers, right? So this argument is essentially, it's not the same house, right? It's a different house now. You know, that's technically true by one very narrow standard, but it seems like a very long way to go to refute this fairly broad and I think uncontroversial point that the First Lady was trying to make. So, you know, that brings us to the question of why it's so hard to agree on the facts, but I think I'll pause here and take questions. We can talk about that or about anything else that came up that you want to ask me about. Thanks.